On the morning of November 12th, 2024, a twin-engine Beechcraft King Air 200 cut through the crisp, turbulent air above the vast expanses of the South Australian outback. The aircraft maintained a rigid altitude of precisely 3,500 feet as its instruments monitored the barren topography below. Inside the pressurized cabin, a specialized array of infrared sensors and thermal imaging cameras hummed, capturing data streams across a swath of land stretching over 40 miles in every direction. Yet, it was not the advanced technology that commanded the attention of the flight crew, but rather an anomalous reading that began to manifest on their primary telemetry screens. The cargo bay of the aircraft carried a highly classified payload of specialized environmental monitoring gear. But what the instruments were detecting on the ground below defied every existing ecological model. Something was moving across the desert floor, an immense, shifting mass that should not have existed, leaving the flight crew to wonder what exactly lay within the heart of this restricted zone and what cataclysmic event was about to unfold. What occurred in the subsequent 72 hours was an ecological phenomenon that absolutely no one predicted. It left veteran researchers entirely bewildered, presenting a biological puzzle that scientists within the international community still discuss, with a mixture of reverence and profound skepticism. My name is Christopher Vance, and this is the full arc of the Great Australian Fence erasure and the unprecedented wildlife resurrection that followed. By the conclusion of this narrative, you will understand three distinct realities. First, how a century of rigid human engineering inadvertently choked the reproductive rhythms of an entire continent. Second, the remarkable mechanical and political effort required to dissolve over 1,000 miles of steel barriers. And third, how nature responds with terrifying velocity when the artificial boundaries of mankind are suddenly stripped away. But to understand the true magnitude of this environmental shift, you must start with something entirely unexpected: the microscopic composition of the Australian desert soil crust and the specialized root systems of the native bladder saltbush. For over a century, conversations regarding the Australian interior focused almost exclusively on livestock and predatory management. However, the foundational health of this landscape depends on a fragile biological carpet of cyanobacteria, lichens, and mosses that stabilize the arid earth. When this crust is intact, it retains moisture and allows specialized flora to thrive. A seminal study published in the journal Austral Ecology in 2012 demonstrated that even minor disruptions to this subterranean matrix can destabilize entire regional weather patterns, causing localized desertification. Within this delicate framework, the red kangaroo functions not merely as a passive inhabitant, but as a critical ecosystem engineer. Its unique grazing patterns and soft padded feet aerates the soil without crushing the microbial crust, facilitating a symbiotic relationship that has endured for millennia. Another comprehensive research paper, featured in the Journal of Arid Environments in 2018, confirmed that the presence of macropodidae species directly correlates with increased soil nitrogen levels and enhanced seed germination rates for native grasses. For generations, this massive biological engine operated without restriction, moving fluidly across the vast, arid interior of the continent in response to distant rainfalls. But that is not what happened when modern agricultural expansion began to carve the landscape into distinct, isolated sectors. Man sought to master the desert by force, erecting barriers that sliced through ancient migratory pathways. What they found next changed everything. The construction of the great pastoral fences, including the legendary Dingo Fence, was hailed as a triumph of human ingenuity over a hostile wilderness. Millions of steel posts were driven into the unforgiving earth, and thousands of miles of wire mesh were unrolled to protect livestock from apex predators and to partition grazing lands. For decades, the system appeared to function precisely as designed. Cattle and sheep multiplied, and the economic output of the interior surged. Yet, beneath this veneer of agricultural success, an invisible crisis was compounding. The fences did not merely exclude predators, they effectively severed the continental circulatory system. Kangaroos, driven by an evolutionary memory that compelled them to chase localized rainstorms across hundreds of miles, found their paths permanently blocked. Starvation became a frequent occurrence along the fence lines, where thousands of animals would accumulate during periods of severe drought, unable to reach the fertile grasslands visible just beyond the wire. The soil on the restricted sides of the barriers began to harden, the microbial crust withered, and the once vibrant saltbush communities degraded into barren dust bowls. The landscape was dying in slow motion, compartmentalized and choked by thousands of tons of galvanized steel. Ecologists warned that the system was approaching a point of total collapse, a threshold from which the native flora and fauna might never recover. Nobody expected what came after. As the decades wore on, the maintenance of these colossal barriers became an unbearable financial and logistical burden for regional governments. The harsh desert environment, characterized by extreme temperature fluctuations, corrosive salt winds, and shifting sand dunes, constantly eroded the infrastructure. Entire sections of the fence lines were buried beneath mountains of migrating sand, requiring continuous excavation by heavy machinery. In other areas, flash floods tore through the valleys, ripping out miles of fencing in a single afternoon. The economic calculus that had once justified the existence of these barriers began to invert. Governments were spending millions of dollars annually simply to maintain a status quo that was actively degrading the foundational productivity of the land. Biologists and progressive land managers argued passionately for a radical reassessment of the landscape, advocating for the selective removal of redundant barriers to allow the ecosystem to breathe. These proposals were met with fierce resistance from conservative agricultural cartels, who feared that any alteration to the boundaries would result in economic ruin and the immediate destruction of their livelihoods. The debate raged in parliament halls and scientific forums for years, paralyzed by bureaucratic inertia and conflicting economic interests, with no clear resolution in sight. But that is not what happened. And here is where the story turns on a piece of pure luck. In the early months of 2024, an unprecedented meteorological anomaly occurred over the central interior of Australia. A series of low-pressure systems, supercharged by an unusual warming pattern in the Indian Ocean, stalled directly over the most arid regions of the continent. Within a matter of weeks, areas that typically received less than 5 inches of rainfall per year were inundated with over 30 inches of water. The resulting deluge transformed dry creek beds into raging torrents and turned vast salt pans into inland seas. This extreme weather event achieved what decades of scientific lobbying could not. It physically obliterated a critical 1,200-mile stretch of secondary and tertiary fencing infrastructure, burying the twisted wreckage under feet of sediment and water. The sheer scale of the destruction rendered immediate repair impossible. The barriers were effectively erased from the map overnight, not by human design, but by the raw, unbridled power of the natural world. This sudden environmental transformation forced a desperate gamble upon regional authorities. With resources stretched to their absolute limits by the regional flooding, a localized administrator made the executive decision to completely abandon the restoration of the 1,200-mile fence line, choosing instead to monitor the ecological fallout. It was a moment of immense tension as pastoralists braced for the predicted catastrophe, fearing that their lands would be overrun by invasive pests and that the remaining livestock would be decimated. To understand the global significance of this moment, scientists began to look across the oceans for a historical precedent, drawing comparisons to the vast plains of North America, where a similar crisis had once unfolded with the American bison. For decades, researchers in the United States believed that restoring the bison to highly managed, fenced reserves would perfectly mirror their historical impact on the prairie ecosystem. But during a major rewilding initiative in the northern plains, an accidental breach of a massive boundary fence revealed a startling truth. When the bison escaped the artificial reserve, their migratory pattern did not follow the expected feeding grounds. Instead, they moved in a perfect geometric line toward a forgotten dried-up riverbed, unlocking a dormant ecological cascade that scientists are still struggling to comprehend. This North American revelation sent shockwaves through the scientific community, forcing Australian researchers to ask whether their own fenced boundaries were hiding an equally explosive biological secret. But the biggest surprise was still to come. The abandonment of the fence line introduced a profound emotional and cultural dimension to the narrative, one that touched upon the deepest history of the Australian continent. For tens of thousands of years, the indigenous populations had managed these lands through a sophisticated understanding of ecological connectivity, practicing a form of stewardship that relied on the unrestricted movement of wildlife. The introduction of European fencing had not only disrupted the animals, but had systematically severed the cultural songlines that mapped the spiritual and physical landscape of the First Nations people. The erasure of the 1,200-mile barrier was viewed by many as a long overdue restoration of ancestral geography, a chance to prove that the ancient ways of coexistence were superior to the rigid, exclusionary practices of modern industrial agriculture. Opponents of this view, however, remained steadfast, forming an antagonistic front that predicted total economic collapse and a permanent degradation of the pastoral economy. They argued that without fences, the land would become an unmanageable wasteland, devoid of structure and vulnerable to total lawlessness. The stakes could not have been higher, as the future of continental land management hung in the balance, suspended between two fundamentally opposing philosophies of human survival and environmental legacy. Then came the payoff, the extraordinary moment that vindicated the dreamers and stunned the pragmatists into absolute silence. As the floodwaters receded, giving way to an unprecedented explosion of green vegetation across the interior, the flight crew of the Beechcraft King Air 200 witnessed a spectacle from their aerial vantage point that defied belief. Across the newly opened 1,200-mile corridor, a colossal migration of red kangaroos was underway, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. From the air, it looked like a living, crimson river flowing effortlessly across the desert floor, a fluid wave of motion that spanned as far as the eye could see. The sensory reality on the ground was overwhelming. The air was thick with the scent of crushed spinifex and damp earth, filled with the deep, rhythmic thumping of countless powerful legs striking the ground in perfect unison, a sound that reverberated through the very bedrock of the outback. The animals were not moving randomly. They were executing a precise, coordinated migration toward the newly revived grasslands, guided by an innate evolutionary compass that had been suppressed for over a century. Where there had been silence, there was now a deafening, vibrant roar of life. Where the land had been broken and empty, it was now whole and overflowing with a dynamic biological energy. The scale of the transformation was staggering, with wildlife densities increasing by over 400% in areas that had been historically classified as ecological dead zones. The pilots flying the observation missions reported that the migrating herds were actively modifying the terrain as they moved. By clearing away the overgrown, highly flammable dry grasses that had accumulated due to decades of poor land management, the kangaroos were creating natural fire breaks, significantly reducing the risk of catastrophic bushfires that had plagued the region for generations. Furthermore, their waste products were acting as a massive natural fertilizer injection, triggering the rapid regeneration of long-dormant native seed banks. The saltbush communities, once on the brink of localized extinction, began to reclaim the desert dunes with unprecedented vigor. The artificial division that had split the continent for a century had been dissolved, and in its absence, the landscape was healing itself at a velocity that no computer model had ever anticipated. The deep wounds inflicted by man-made barriers were vanishing beneath a blanket of green, proving that the resilience of the natural world, when granted the freedom to move, is far greater than the structures designed to contain it. In the quiet that has followed this great continental awakening, we are forced to confront a deeper, more enduring truth about our relationship with the planet we inhabit. We spend centuries building walls to secure our short-term prosperity, only to discover that the very boundaries we construct to protect our wealth ultimately impoverish the deeper systems that sustain our existence. The erasure of the Australian fence reminds us that true stewardship is not defined by how effectively we can conquer and divide the wilderness, but by how gracefully we can learn to coexist with its ancient, unbroken rhythms. It is a lesson in humility, a powerful reminder that the land possesses a memory far longer than our own, and a wisdom that cannot be bound by steel or wire. What we choose to leave open for the next generation will ultimately define the legacy of our own. What are your thoughts on this extraordinary ecological transformation? And do you believe mankind should continue to dismantle these massive artificial boundaries around the world? If you found value in this story of natural resilience, please consider subscribing to the channel to support more deep dive documentaries. My name is Christopher Vance, and thank you for listening.